Thanks, David. It's conventional wisdom has it you kick off a conference with a sexy topic to get everybody going for the week. So we're off with accountancy, which I think is quite a brave move on David's part. But actually, as many of you in this room will know, it's a particularly topical subject. You can't pick up a newspaper today without reading about the latest accountancy scandal. Can I just see how many accountants there are in the room? Is there any indication? I mean, you don't have to... Yeah, quite a few. Like a sort of soft rock concert or something. You can't really... every day we find the latest scandal. Last week it was Thomas Cook. We see the accountants not doing their job. If you look back over the last couple of years, over here you had Carillion, thousands of people losing their job. Before that, you had the financial crisis wreaking havoc across the world, and if you look closely, you see the accountants at the heart of that. So 3 or 4 years ago, I thought, well, maybe we should take a closer look at the people who are controlling this profession that's so important. In my day job, working for Private Eye, I found the accountants at the scene of pretty much every crime, whether it was an accountancy failure or a public service failure often, where their consultancy divisions had moved in and offered advice that turned out not really to be what people wanted. So what was going on? Who were these people? And it would have been easy to write a hatchet job with a list of all the accountancy failures of the last 20 years. You could fill 2 or 3 books with that. But when I started researching the subject, what struck me as really missing from the debate was an appreciation of how important accountancy is and how much value it has given to the business world, to commerce, and to society in general throughout history. Going right back 5,000 or 6,000 years to the advent of writing itself. Writing was really created in order to account civilizations that needed to, rather than just consume the food they found, they needed to trade, to make records of what they had, what they exchanged, and so on. And that gave the need for accounting. And the first writing, this cuneiform script, for example, from Mesopotamia, is actually accounting. That's ledgers for you, early ledgers for you. And without accounting, it's arguable that commerce wouldn't have got to where it is today. Some of the great leaps came with leaps in accounting. In late medieval Italy, for example, double-entry bookkeeping came to the fore. New numeral systems from Asia allowed a new system of accounting called double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed businesses to not just to understand how much cash they had, how much stock they had, but to understand their commercial position, how much profit they were making, who they owed money, who owed them money. And that facilitated co-investment and expansion of great business empires. One of the biggest of them all was the Medici banking empire. And some historians have looked at that. And there's what one has said about the Medicis, that they actually built this empire on accountancy. It was through sound accounting that the Medicis were able to create this world banking empire, and it was also through very poor accounting that it fell apart. The chap with the dark hair on that painting, for that detail from a painting in Florence, is Lorenzo Medici, who was the kind of wastrel really who took over the family in the 15th century, late 15th century. And the chap on the right is the accountant, his accountant Sassetti, who gave up doing the accounts properly. Medici thrived when they had a really good accountant, which I go through in the book in some length, called Giovanni Benci, who looked after the books, ensured all the money was accounted for properly, assured that all the debts were fully monitored, that the people running the local branches had to come in and explain who they'd lent money to, that these were still valuable. This guy took over and gave up, and he kind of got interested in the Renaissance and paintings and building his own chapel and that kind of thing. And the empire fell apart as a result of that. It was one of the first examples of an accounting failure. Thankfully, there was this chap on hand to tell us how to do it properly, Luca Pacioli, who in 1494 wrote his opus on he was a mathematician, a Franciscan friar, who also worked with Leonardo da Vinci, explaining to him rules on perspective and things like that. But his claim to fame, alas, is to have codified double-entry bookkeeping. And he wrote in a book called Summa de Arithmetica exactly how it should be done. He wrote how you keep ledgers, how you transpose those into accounting entries. And there's an original copy of his book that went on sale at Christie's last year, sold for $1.2 million. A bit of product placement just there. That's the other one is available for sale, actually, next door afterwards. There's an extract from the book showing how closely accounting was related to the great scientific and mathematical innovations of the day. And here are some of the lessons Mr. Pacioli has for us on how to account properly. Account regularly, close your ledgers, it's good. Frequent accounting makes for long friendships, that's worth remembering. And if you're not a good bookkeeper, your business you'll go groping like a blind man and may meet great losses. I mean, these lessons are pretty timeless. They could have been in the FT last week, for example. But here's a really telling point, and this gets to the heart of the double-entry bookkeeping system that feeds through into all the scandals you see today. At one point, Pacioli tells us that, as you all know, as the many accountants in the room know, a key part of any double-entry system is how you value your assets and your inventories and so on. And he tells us that, he's essentially telling us to cook the books. He says, if these items of inventory are worth 20, you put down 24 so that you can make a larger profit. Now, I'm sure all the accountants will know exactly how that happens. And that is any accounting scandal you look at, historically or recent times, Enron, for example, WorldCom, the financial crisis, the assets on the banks, dodgy assets on the bank's balance sheets, overvalued. This is at the heart of it. And the pious Father Pacioli has enjoined us to cook the books. We then sort of fast-forwarding a bit through history, Industrial Revolution created a profession, the accountancy profession, really. If you look at all the big four firms today, which not so long ago were a big six, before that were a big eight, and you look at the origins of them, their founders generally were in the cities of London, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Liverpool, all providing accounting for the new enterprises of the Industrial Revolution, particularly the railways. And they with the Industrial Revolution also came great changes in the nature of company ownership, so investment in companies. You had joint stock companies, so you had people who needed to know that their money was being looked after properly. great demand for accountancy. Then you had limited liability introduced in the 19th century, again creating this kind of agency problem, which demanded that there was someone independent to check the books. And that gave us in this country the requirement for companies to be audited in 1900, although governments have kind of rode back on that a bit for certain smaller companies since then. But all this professionalization of accountancy positioned the profession perfectly to change once industry changed. And instead of just checking the books, accountants were ideally placed to advise on how to run businesses. First, through disciplines like cost accounting. Some of you may have seen the film Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin. The great industrialization or the streamlining of industry in America in that case. Much of that was on the back of cost accounting techniques. Those accountants, of course, then some of them moved not just from the shop floor advising on industrial processes, but into the boardroom. And firms like McKinsey, James McKinsey was an accountant in Chicago. He turned cost consultancy into management consultancy. So accountancy gave us management consultancy, which now we find is kind of consuming accountancy itself, as we'll come on to. And the main pioneer also of combining consultancy with accountancy was, of course, Arthur Andersen. That firm particularly capitalized on the new IT technology post-war. It took military technology and put it into the big American corporations. And that was their route, and in fact, all the accountancy firms' routes ultimately into management or consultancy and management consultancy. And with this gradual commercialization, there was a change in the nature of the accountancy profession. We're looking here at the Big 8, Big 6, and Big 5 as they narrow down at these 3 points. In 1975, they were predominantly accountants. By 1990, that's pretty much the point at which less than 50% of their income came from auditing. At that point, they turned from auditors into consultants generally, much of it on tax consultancy. By 2000, you can see that they are, if you added those second 2 bars up, they would be kind of 2/3 consultancy, 1/3 auditing. They changed character dramatically. Their core central purpose was no longer getting the numbers right, as it had been in the Victorian times. It was now helping companies get the best numbers. And this is what gave us all these late 1990s, early 2000s scandals, especially in America, where, which names that you're probably all familiar with. All of those involved the accountancy firms, all the Big Four. You could attach one of the Big Four to all of those, conniving with those companies in manipulating the numbers to please the stock market. Arthur Levitt, who was the Securities Exchange Commission chairman back in the 90s, called it the numbers game. Accountancy became a numbers game. It wasn't about getting the numbers right, it was about getting the numbers right for the stock market that quarter. And that's what drove, if you read, for example, the history of the Enron story, the smartest guys in the room, you can see that quarter after quarter they're driven to create ever more elaborate financial instruments to drive up cash, drive up profit, hide debt, in order to convince the market that they have the growth required to sustain the share price. And of course, it's because, and their auditor, Arthur Andersen, was of course advising them on how to do that. And that was because of the change in the nature of the profession in the preceding years. There was inevitably some backlash. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act came in the US, which was supposed to clear things up. George W. Bush said that when he signed it off, he said that the era of low standards and false profits is over. That was 2002. That proved optimistic, to say the least. About 5 or 6 years later, this was the scene across America. And again, this was a classic accounting failure. If you look at and in the book I studied the nature of the subprime lending bubble at the start of the 21st century and the following years, there were clear signs that this was a bubble that was going to burst. Some of you may have seen the film, The Big Short. There was no great secret to what those guys did. They just got batches of mortgages that were being securitized, and they looked at the quality of the mortgages. They looked at rates of default, and they saw that they were bad. The telling thing was that the auditors, the ones who should really have been doing that for the subprime lending companies, didn't do that. And KPMG were at the heart of this. They dominated the subprime auditing for the subprime lending market. New Century, Countrywide, all these firms, KPMG were either turning a blind eye to overvalued mortgages, or they were, in some cases, actually assisting the company in overvaluing them. And they were heavily fined in a number of cases. It's a kind of slightly underrated role of the big accountancy firms in the financial crisis, because, of course, once these mortgages were effectively approved by the auditors, because they'd said the company selling them that they were all fine, those mortgages were packaged up, fed into the great sausage machine of the investment banking world, and they became the collateralized debt obligations and all the rest of it, and became the basis for all other weird and wonderful financial instruments that eventually crashed the system. It was, crap in, crap out. And KPMG ticked up the crap as it went in, which was in many ways, a tragic place for a firm like KPMG to have got to. This is a chap called James Marwick. I'm afraid on another version, I do have comments about him from KPMG's official history. And he was one of the M's in KPMG originally. He went to America in the early 1890s to set up business there. And he made his name by uncovering overvalued mortgages at a mortgage lender in New York, and insisting that they, against much resistance from the company, insisting that they wrote down the values of these mortgages and provided for their eventual failure. And that's how this guy made the company's name in New York. Now he's spinning in his grave, I think. So, there's many other examples. I think Simon might talk about one or two of where the Big Four really were a major facilitator of the financial crisis by allowing many financial problems to go unreported, by approving figures that shouldn't have been approved. But did they learn from it? What happened after that? After the financial crisis, the interesting thing I found was that they didn't commit any more to auditing at all. It was clear that this rickety financial system and many other parts of the business world needed much closer attention from the auditors. But did they get it? No. They didn't spend any more on auditing. What they did spend a lot more on was consultancy. It was as if the financial crisis had happened for the banks, it had happened for the politicians, but it hadn't happened for the accountants. They just escaped scot-free. Even the official US government report into the financial crisis barely touched them. Here, one or two parliamentarians had some unflattering things to say, but there was no real action. They were not exactly chastened. In fact, this is what they did. This is what KPMG did. It set up its own private members club in Mayfair, which I snuck into 3 or 4 years ago. That's its cocktail bar. It was a bit early in the morning, so even the bean counters weren't on the sauce at that point. Those pictures you can see by the lifts, they are Mr. K, Mr. P, Mr. M, and Mr. G. There's, I think it's James Marwick on the second from the right, gazing down on their successors. It was funny. As part of writing the book, I did interview the senior partner in the UK at KPMG, Simon Collins, and asked him. I said, what do you think people like James Marwick would think of you setting up a members club in Mayfair when you're supposed to be checking the books? He said, oh, I think they'd be really proud of us. The lack of self-awareness is quite remarkable. Or it wasn't until last week when it was announced that this was closing down. So I'll leave it there for the time being. I think we have a profession that we may later on get on to talk about how it is being or should be reformed. But I think we still have an accountancy profession that doesn't quite understand how important it is. That's one big problem, I think. I think that others, lawyers, medics, people kind of understand what they're about and what their core purpose is in the world. And they really appreciate the value of what they do. I don't think accountants do. I don't think they understand the value of it. And I certainly don't think they are yet putting their core job of getting the numbers right at the center of what they do. And we need to do something about that. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Simon Bowers. I work for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. If you've not heard of us, we're a global organization. We bring together media from around the world to work on big cross-border stories, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers. Those were some of our projects in the financial space. And just following on from some of the stuff that Richard has said, obviously, I thought it'd be helpful to talk through maybe one or two examples of where the accounting profession has hit trouble. And there's too many to choose from. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. There's an enormous amount, but you can always argue. You always face the counter argument that, well, that's only one opinion. The professional grown-ups have signed off on this perspective on this particular company, and you can have all the alternative opinions you like, but we're sticking with this opinion. Opinions, if you have the money, are easy to come by. But I think this is it's a bit old, but it's a particularly helpful example that avoids that type of criticism. It's the case of AIG and Goldman's. There was a very large credit default swap that Goldman's took out with AIG over largely subprime mortgages. And when things got sort of nasty towards, it was the summer of 2007, AIG, this chap on the left here, Joe Cassano, working in London, Mayfair, just a few streets along, I guess, from KPMG's office. He got an email saying, we'd like $1 billion, please, in collateral from Goldman Sachs. And, he really sort of spat out his cornflakes and couldn't believe this, because as he understood it, there was no rights to call collateral on this credit default swap, and the credit default swap was a sort of Titanic. It was unsinkable, and it could never really default. And this is what he'd been telling the markets. And even after receiving that call, August 2007, he made this remark to investors on a call without being flippant, even to see a scenario within any kind of realm of reason that would see us losing $1 in any of those transactions. It's hard for us to see that. Okay, so that's what he's saying. And then you've got this sort of horrible, agonizing, it's like the processes of grief or realization that he's on the wrong side of the argument. A step down, no one see, this is what he's saying next. Okay, well, maybe we do need to put a value on these securities, but no one in the market seems to know what the value is. And that's his next step-back defense. And then his third step-back defense is, oh, well, I've got a new method. It's called the negative basis adjustment, and the loss is only 1.5 billion, not the multiple billions that Goldman's are asking for. But it's not until February 2008 that PwC, auditors to AIG, say, actually, yeah, that's garbage, that 1.5 billion. And that negative adjustment model that you've made up is unjustifiable. So, but it took PwC from August 2007 to February 2007 to force the company to say that. Now, this is a chap, Charlie Munger. You may know his name. He's the right-hand man of Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway, and he gets particularly cross on these kind of issues. How can you have two companies on either side of a valuation having different views, both saying that this trade is a profit for them? It's a zero-sum game. They cannot both be in profit. He said it violates the most elemental principles of common sense to have both claiming they're making a profit. I don't know if he was specifically talking about AIG or Goldman's, but the reason why I think this is a great example is because who advised both parties on valuations of this credit default swap? PwC. There's no way they can come back and say, oh, well, that's your opinion, we're sticking by our opinion, because they were providing the opinion on both sides of the valuation. I really like Munger because he's really got it in for the accountants. These are some of his gems. They fail utterly, time after time after time. The accounting profession is a sewer. You know, it's always comforting as a journalist if you're calling out a profession to have someone, you know, brighter than you being more aggressive than you are in criticisms. I'm going to jump forward. Sorry, I'm going a bit slow, but this is 2014 at ICIJ. We were lucky enough to get hold of a whistleblower passed us some. Richard was talking earlier about how it's accounting professions had migrated away from straightforward checking the books to all sorts of other areas. In particular, one was tax. And in Luxembourg, PwC and other firms were providing these extraordinary sort of through the Alice in Wonderland type structures that were highly artificial, that pushed profits through Luxembourg, where they were particularly able to shed tax liabilities. And the structures are very complicated, but they all effectively did the same thing. They sucked profits to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, where they effectively disappeared for tax purposes. GSK, ICAP, Skype were some of the memorable examples. And by the way, I should say that was from a project we did called LuxLeaks, and this is one called Paradise Papers. And this is Lewis Hamilton. That's the snaps are from his Instagram account, and you can see he loves his jet, his big red jet. And he got that in 2013, and he had a 3.3 million pound VAT bill to pay. But the accountants and lawyers that advised him were able to come up with this structure where if he had it for a business use, how does this work? So he imports it into Europe, into a company that then leases it to an arm's length third-party jet leasing company, and that jet leasing company leases it back to a company that he uses and he himself for his exclusive use. And now that relationship between him and this third-party leasing company is purportedly a business use. That's the kind of sort of voodoo structuring that you get that manufactures these kind of tax-saving opportunities. This is Antoine Deltour here, jumping back. He's the whistleblower who, one of the whistleblowers, two whistleblowers who provided the LuxLeaks data to some journalists who shared it with ICIJ, and he is an incredible character. He was very young when he was working in Luxembourg as a PwC trainee, and he just felt it was what they were doing was awful. These structures that were leaching tax revenues from exchequers across Europe, and so he left. He took these files with him, and he shared them. But he was found out, and he was prosecuted. PwC in Luxembourg vigorously pressed charges. They represented in court as he was prosecuted by the Luxembourg prosecutor, and they stood up and said, "This is not a whistleblower. He has revealed no wrongdoing by us at PwC, and we've done nothing illegal, and he's a thief, and he's in it for the money." I mean, it was a laughable argument, but it was sustained for quite some time, and it was an argument that applied to another, his fellow whistleblower, Raphael Allais, who's still fighting his case in the European Court of Human Rights. Only recently, only this year, almost 5 years on from LuxLeaks, the European Commission has finally taken a case and says that the LuxLeaks revelations, at least one representative case from there, that did amount to illegal state aid. So the argument that they revealed nothing unlawful is perhaps not true. This is the final example I'll talk about, which is a chap called Amjad Rihan. Now we're jumping to a whistleblower in another part of the world. This is Dubai. This is where EY are at work. Dubai is a massive center for gold trading. And gold is imported from all over the world. And the big concern is whether this gold obviously is a highly useful asset for money launderers, and it's involved. There's a lot of gold is tainted with, comes from conflict zones, and there's all sorts of horrible things can be associated with gold. And Amjad's job was to sign off Dubai's largest gold refiner, Kaluti, which was processing billions of dollars of gold through its books. And he went in there with his team, and he saw in the offices mountains of cash in the back room in their offices in the gold souk in Dubai. And he's like, "What's that?" And he said, and they say, "Oh, people come in off the street and we buy their gold and sell and give them cash." And he's like, "Well, do you know where that gold comes from?" And they're like, "Well, not really." And we're talking more than 5 billion in a year. It's a ridiculous amount of cash to be handing out. And a ridiculous amount of gold to be coming into the country. I mean, it's just, when you get to that level, those kind of numbers, it's really quite extraordinary. Anyway, Amjad says there's a problem here. He raises it, and he raises it with the company. And then he gets a call, or EY get a call from the local regulator in Dubai. Or rather, no, the company called and said, would it help if the local regulator, if we got the local regulator to change the dates of this audit inspection you're doing? And so it became very apparent to him that it was going to be extremely hard for him to get his message across, and that what they didn't want to hear it. The company didn't want to hear it, the regulator didn't want to hear it, and Dubai is not a friendly place for people who speak out of turn. So he fled with his family, and he came to the UK, and he gave some of his data to journalists, and we wrote it up. And of course, it was embarrassing for the companies involved, for EY and the gold refiner, but they've continued to fight him. They're not paying him what he'd already earned before he left the company. He had a lot of equity locked in, and they attacked his reputation, and so that this is a fight that's still going on for him. And then an interesting development. This was a few years ago. An interesting development just a couple of weeks ago. Some brilliant journalists at Cash Investigation in France and the BBC Panorama in the UK, they joined some dots between a French court case, one of the largest drug firms, largest drug smugglers, cannabis drug gangs in Europe had been on a massive scale laundering their drug proceeds by buying gold in Belgium, shipping it to Dubai, and walking into the offices of this very same company and selling that gold for cash that they were then able to wash through a money transfer system. So precisely the gold that Amjad had seen and precisely the cash that he'd seen had been used in this. It was about 200 million euro money laundering scheme. The guys involved were prosecuted in France. The ringleader is still at large, and Amjad is still at large, and he is still fighting with EY for the money he is owed. I'll leave it there with those examples. Thank you.
Sorry, can you have the last couple of slides of, cheers. I think those examples Simon's given from across the range of areas, from tax avoidance to checking the numbers to rubber stamping some seriously illicit transactions, prove that around the world some very serious reform is needed. I mean, we could go through, you could go across the globe and point out to other systemic failings where the accountants are right at the heart of it. One thing I wrote about recently in Private Eye was how all the Big Four had effectively approved some of the money laundering systems out of the former Soviet republics by giving the rubber stamp to the really notoriously filthy banks in places like Latvia, some in Cyprus and so on, despite knowing that they were up to their necks in money laundering. The profession needs reform. The Big Four firms need reform. They need to get back to what they should be doing. What are they doing? Well, in the UK, let's just look at the UK for the moment. The government has promised a tough new regulator. And this is another story we've been covering in Private Eye. But a mark of how serious they are seems to me to be in the person they've chosen. This chap is the new chairman of the Financial Reporting Council, which is soon to become the Audit Reporting Governance Authority, which is going to have tougher powers. And he's a kind of textbook business establishment figure, former finance director of GlaxoSmithKline. Maybe a good egg, but when we look a bit more closely at him, this is his own company. This is his own personal investment company. It's getting on for a year late with its accounts. It's racked up around £3,000 in fines. I've asked him repeatedly if he's going to file accounts for this company, and he just won't reply. Must have asked half a dozen times. The accounts that were filed, the last time he filed accounts, for 2017, they had a monumental error in them. This company buys property on his behalf. He and his wife are directors. It left out one of the property purchases. Oh, sorry, that's £300,000 property. We just forgot to include in the accounts. Now, we can all make mistakes. Late with your accounts isn't the crime of the century, but when it gets this late, it's not great. It is technically a crime. It's a criminal offence. But is that really the person to be running the auditing and corporate governance and reporting authority in Britain? It sounds like just an attack on him. It's not really. It's an attack on the government that thinks this is okay. And it's, I suggest, an indication of how serious, or not seriously, that certainly the government in Britain is taking this issue. And it's also a plug for a private eye story that I can never pass up. So what reforms we really need? We need serious people running these institutions. We need serious investigators running the regulators. We need the big four firms to be completely separated. There are proposals, he says here, break up the big four. Well, when you look closely, it doesn't really mean break up the big four. It's something called an operational split. We need them completely separated. We need accountants to be accountants again. Consultants can be consultants. And in the book, I come up with a list of other recommendations, which I think also include removing the profit motive from auditing, certainly for the major systemically important institutions, which I think needs to become a public regulatory function rather than a private function for profit. So those are my ideas on reform. I'd be very interested in anybody else's, and perhaps if you have any, we'd take some questions now. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So, presumably, accountants are getting sued a lot. Are you aware of any sort of liability issues? Big payouts, and I presume that they're settling cases left, right, and centre, often for substantial amounts of money, which I presume are being paid by their insurance companies. Can you give us an indication of liability, insurance premiums, and whether, despite all of this, it's still extremely profitable?
The interesting point, which I think you're raising, is that alongside the commercial development of the big accountancy firms from the 70s and 80s to today, came a simultaneous relinquishing of liability. The other thing the accountants, as well as making money, the big accountancy firms have been very good at fleeing any responsibility for what they do. So they have, around the world, created limited liability forms of incorporation. courts have helpfully distanced the auditors from the consequences of poor auditing. And those court decisions haven't been reversed by governments, even though they've been encouraged by some to do so. So the big accountancy firms are in a position where they can take the profit, but with limited liability partnership status, for example, can pretty much dodge the consequences. And it's hard to find. You do sometimes find accountancy firms being sued, but not for very much. And they can generally settle for not very much because their liability is going to be severely limited. And it's, you know, a small, very small cost of doing business. The regulators have increased the fines they impose quite a bit, but it's still pretty small. If you look at, for example, you look at the major failings in cases like British home stores, the fines have been of the order of 5 or 6 million pounds, which when you compare with turnover in the UK for PwC in that case, or 2 billion or so a year, it's really peanuts. There isn't a serious penalty and a serious deterrent from poor auditing yet.
And what does the legal structure look like? So KPMG, for example, where is it legally headquartered, and what is the legal relationship like with, let's say, KPMG Bermuda, KPMG the Cayman Islands, or KPMG anywhere? I presume they're sort of independent companies. Do they pay a licensing fee for the name? Are they kicking up profits?
Yeah. Well, the key thing is that legally they are independent. I think KPMG is a Dutch cooperative that's based in Switzerland or something like that. You know, each has their own slightly strange coordinating entity at the centre, but the entities around the world are legally distinct, and that's a very important part of the business model, because it allows the firms to trade on the names and to use the names to win business all around the world, whether it's in, you know, former Soviet or, you know, in Asia or anywhere. But at the same time, not to pick up any of the legal consequences when things go wrong in those places.
Do they pay like a franchise fee, like, you know, McDonald's, for example? You know,
I think they often have a sort of cost-sharing arrangement, and effectively, yes, those entities around the world do pay for the use of the brand and so on.
So it's just a name, right? I mean, KPMG is just a name, and if somebody wanted to set up a KPMG wherever, I presume they just license the name. Is that pretty much how it works?
I think the control is closer than that. I think there is a much greater management than often they would have you believe. And, you know, there's very tight control, for example, over use of names, slogans even, for example. EY registers its name and its slogan in a Bahamas company. So, for example, their slogan is, the better the question, the better the answer. That's registered in the Bahamas.
But let's say KPMG in Bermuda, what percentage of their profits, if any, or is there a fixed fee that they would pay to the head corporation for the use of the name? Anything, you know, maybe some shared resources?
I think it's relatively small. I don't know exactly, but I think it's relatively small. So the partners there keep the profits. But there's mutual benefit because, you know, as long as you have the right people there, you are winning business for the firm globally. The firm needs a presence in all those locations. So you can get slightly distracted by the legal structure. Really, it's one organisation. The legal structure is put in place in order to ensure that legal liability is ring-fenced in different territories.
But do the main partners in the main company, for example, let's just take Bermuda, sort of go to Bermuda and sort of train the staff in, you know, these are the minimal requirements for being a KPMG, you know, what is essentially a franchise? Like McDonald's, for example. You go to any McDonald's, they all look the same, right? They serve pretty much the same food. I mean, it's all standardized. Does that go on in the accounting profession, or could KPMG in the Cayman Islands be materially different to KPMG in Bermuda?
I think they would say their values are consistent around the world, and the international board would have members responsible for those jurisdictions. So, they certainly would say they would claim consistency in standards around the world.
They have global ethics principles as well, all the big four that people are supposed to adhere to. And obviously, a lot of their most important clients are multinationals, so they'll be looking to play off their global spread when they're pitching for business. So the way I see it in discussion with big four partners and former partners, they in good times and in outward presentation, they are one in lockstep and one group, and in bad times and trouble, they are a franchise model with sort of rogue operators who've let the side down.
That was very much the response, for example, to the major scandal in South Africa involving the Gupta family, where KPMG were badly implicated in that. The response was, "This isn't who we are. This is rogue practice in another firm." But of course, when it came to taking all the spin-off businesses from South Africa around the world, they were one KPMG, and that's the inconsistency, that slight hypocrisy at the heart of the model. So, a gentleman on that third or fourth row.
If you could wait for the mic, because we're audio recording and it won't be picked up otherwise. Thanks.
So, do you think that there's a market for honest accountants? Right, the Big Four has 99 of the biggest 100 firms in the world as clients. And having worked at big companies, every single firm does consulting for every big company, right?
Market for honest accountants. That's sort of gets to the heart of it. I think you need a system where there's an incentive for honesty or real objectivity, and it doesn't sort of come through markets, I don't think. It comes through ethics. It comes from a sort of purpose, a professional drive, really, that isn't tainted or isn't thrown off by a competing commercial incentive. I think that's the issue with accountancy. That accountants often sit there as kind of judge and jury on a company. Very few people are able to challenge them. So it's not lawyers, for example. Lawyers generally, when a lawyer offers an opinion on something, there's another lawyer on the other side offering a competing opinion. So things get tested. With accountants views often don't get tested. So it's even more important that they aren't kind of tainted or have incentives that kind of draw away from getting it right.
I think people are drawn to that solution because it looks like a monopoly style or closed shop environment. But is this a topic where really competition is the answer? I don't want to repeat what Richard said, but you can imagine a scenario where if you've got a beauty parade of accountants coming in to see you and you're a big corporation, you're going to be thinking, well, which one is going to be most flexible for us? And that seems to be deeply unhelpful.
Lady. Oh, sorry. Ewan's got the microphone. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, former lawyer, Customs and Excise intelligence analyst. My question is something of a devil's advocate question. Please don't take it as a criticism. I have been at the KPMG Private Members Club for a conference on better tackling dirty money. which did have government, the private sector, and law enforcement. As we walked out at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon, an awful lot of Rolex watches in dark suits were walking in. My question is, how do the big companies have something of a defense where they are working in, let's be frank about it, non-democratic or partly democratic states without a fully functioning rule of law, and where they have to bend to political and increasingly geopolitical issues? I think the Dubai case, the Panorama program on the gold, has an awful lot to say about that. But also, we're getting to see this in Hong Kong. I was at a conference run by The Economist just over a year ago in Abu Dhabi, where a senior official from Dubai made comments about the tax system there, and he made it clear that that is a tool of the intelligence state. You just won't get that. The tax officials in a democratic country just won't say that. At least they won't say it publicly. So where does it all fit in? Because I think we've got some real challenges coming up which may involve some nasty compromises. Thanks a lot. I thought explaining the structures and the franchises, thank you very much. Brilliant.
Thanks. Sorry, Karen.
I think that's a good point. The way that sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
So I think the point about how these firms should operate in difficult places where there may be lack of democracy, a lot of corruption. The former Soviets, case in point, the Big Four went out there in the early 90s, and clearly you're going to be confronted with some sort of dilemma. But I don't think it was to them. They just made hay. All the major privatized Russian corporations were fiddling their books to one degree or another. The Big Four didn't raise any questions. They only qualified audits when they were told to. In the case of UKOS, when Putin decided that Khodorkovsky was becoming too much trouble, then PwC complied with the authorities. So you would have expected major Western firms that espoused such values of integrity and so on to say, well, hang on, these places are just, we can't operate to those values in these places. Now what do we do? But they never even raised that as a point. They just carried on. And therefore played a key part, I think, in entrenching some of these pretty corrupt regimes and kleptocratic systems, because that became the way that the money got out of the former Soviet countries, through those companies that the major Big Four audit firms were saying were fine.
Sorry, I can't come back to my train of thought. I totally agree with the point you're making. You've got the world is not doing business is not even and identikit in all jurisdictions. It's an entirely fair point, but let's not pretend that it is. And I think that's where it's an argument that's commonly made in industries where like the arms trade, where that it's argued that bribery is just a cost of business. You can't make sales without performing to local customs, and that may be the reality, but I think as journalists we've got to call out when people are saying one thing and doing something else.
In the interest,
sorry.
Sorry, yeah, Nick Matthews, Duff & Phelps. Just in the interest of balance, not all accountants are auditors. It's a long time since I was a Big Four accountant, a long time since I was an auditor. But accountants also do investigate these things. And if I ever wrote a book, it would be The Poetry of Double Entry Bookkeeping, because the fact that if you've got a loss, there's got to be a hole there somewhere. So it is useful as well, but I appreciate what you're saying around some of the failings, and perhaps the issue is not that accountancy has broken capitalism, it's just exposed capitalism for what it is. There isn't much money in audit. The reason that accountants have gone to consultancy is because there isn't the money in audit. And a lot of the failings in audit are not deliberate malicious. They are due to trying to get as efficient as possible, and the efficiencies have exposed some issues which haven't been picked up. So perhaps it's a big question, and too much for today as to how you reform that audit market, but it's around, I think it's around the way the audit market has evolved in the capitalist society.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, that seems to be you're talking about the kind of what's happened to auditing. That seems to me to be a function of having a competitive audit market. And, you know, I don't think, certainly at the top end for major corporations, competition for audit is the right method, because what happens with competition is that prices get driven down, quality gets driven down. The same firms have to compensate and make their money elsewhere through consultancy and so on. And that, you know, that was actually, that happened in spades in America in the 70s, for example, when auditors became consultants as well. That's when they noticed a significant drop in the quality of auditing. And I don't think it's recovered.
I'll go, if that's okay. So I'm from an offshore jurisdiction where the Big Four has a particularly big presence, as I'm sure it does in lots of them. And, you know, that can be in terms of socially, in terms of the number of employees they bring from other places to work, particularly in auditing, the consultancy side, getting work for the government. And I just wondered how central to their business models, I know it's broken down and diversified to an extent given the structure you described earlier, but how central are offshore jurisdictions to the Big Four? And in your experience looking at them, what functions in particular are done there? It would seem to me that auditing is particularly important in offshore jurisdictions.
I'll talk about the ICIJ. I mean, you couldn't. You see them everywhere in the, for example, the Apple Papers leaks, the Paradise Papers leaks. You could see Big Four firms providing pretty much every service.
I've spent an unhealthy amount of time looking at leaks of offshore data, and albeit I can't pretend it's definitely a representative example data set, but in my experience, that the real power in offshore finance lies with the specialist magic circle law firms, and obviously the Big Four have representation and have to have representation, and they perform a facilitation role to the controversial structures that involve offshore, but I think it's driven by the law firms there.
Okay, it's slightly off tangent, but we talked about regulation of auditors. The big offshore law firms, do you perceive a gap in terms of regulation, in terms of the sort of structuring and that side of their business that perhaps maybe doesn't come under a particular remit?
I don't know. I mean, I think legal professionals have always been attracted to the margins of the law. That's where their business opportunity lies, and I suppose what we're trying to discuss in terms of accountancy is perhaps, maybe if accountancy could be more plodding and less controversial, then that would be a good thing. I think it's hard to say that about lawyers. That's my off the bat response.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sigrun Davidsdottir. I'm an Icelandic journalist based in London. Regarding the financial crisis and the accountants, I believe actually that Iceland, as far as I've been told, is the only country, and it's the only case where the accountants have actually paid the estates of the three largest banks sued the accountants, and these are, I believe, KPMG and PwC, and the accountants actually paid damages. Now, this is all private settlement, so we don't know what they settled, but I believe if this had not been Iceland, but some other country, this would have been headline news all over the world, because as I say, I've been told that this is actually the only example of this. But my question is, given that the treasuries both in the UK and Ireland, for example, organized huge big bailouts of the banks, do you know where there are actually no discussions within the Treasury as this was being organized, as if they shouldn't turn to the accountants?
Well, there were some discussions in the months leading up to the financial crisis that were kept secret. They emerged in an inquiry, parliamentary inquiry, 3 or 4 years later. Because the big four firms knew that one or two of the banks were not going concerns at the end of December 2007. And they should have put some qualification in their audit reports to that effect. But they didn't want to do that. And they received a nod and a wink from a Treasury Minister that the government would do whatever was required. And on that basis, they were able to sign off the accounts as saying these banks are going concerns. Now, that gave them some sort of cover, but it completely misled the public, the investing public, everyone who ended up paying for the bailout that came along. And it kind of showed how unfit for purpose the whole regulatory system when it came to accounting was. It showed that accounting was an essential part of the regulatory system, but there was no coordination of it. In the months and years before, the auditors had never spoken, or once or twice spoken to the financial conduct or the banking regulators to alert them to any concerns. So everyone was pretending that everything was all right until the last minute, and then they were just given a kind of nod and a wink, not written down, and they went away and ticked up the accounts, which led to disaster. If they hadn't done that, then steps could have been taken much earlier.
And there was no discussion of suing for damages?
No, in the UK, the auditors have not been. They've been criticised by a couple of parliamentary inquiries, but they've not been otherwise held to account. And indeed, one of the things I talk about in the book is how the people who ran the banking auditing practices and audited the big banks simply progressed up the career ladders within the big accountancy firms. The people who ran the firms while they were turning a blind eye to all the dodgy financial, subprime assets and so on, they now, they went on to run the firms, acquire chairmanships of FTSE companies and so on. There was no comeback.
Yes, I have a question. Basically, I myself trained Big Four auditor 20 years ago. I have read your report here. The issue is, what about the accountancy regulators, like, for example, the ICAEW, the ACCA, who are training those accountants, who are taking the exams of the accountants and bringing them into the market? Big Four is one thing, but what about these institutes who are training those accountants? Do you think responsibility also lies on them?
The professional institutes, yeah, definitely. I mean, they have quite a noble tradition, but they have questions to answer about what they are, what standards they're instilling in their members. What about training? There are a huge number of cultural issues about training, about recruitment into the profession. They're certainly not short of resources. When accountancy firms are fined, on the rare occasions they are fined, the fines actually make their way back through the professional institutions into the firms themselves. So they really should be learning some lessons. Yeah, I agree.
I think the setting of international accounting standards as well, and the influence that the accounting profession has over that that highly technical process is an interesting one. And obviously, you know, we've seen in other highly technical specialist industries like manufacturing Boeing aircraft that handing too much leeway over standard setting to the industry is not always a healthy thing.
Hey, do you think that the introduction of audit mandatory rotation has or will make much of a difference?
No, you know, we're in one of those phases. I pointed out earlier on the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the US. There was similar changes to corporate governance codes here. We have these periodic changes to regulations and rules that don't address the model. That's the problem. So mandatory rotation of auditors, well, I'm not sure. Of course, you don't, that there are firms that have been audited by the same company for over 100 years, for example, but that's not ideal. And there is something to be said for changing auditors reasonably regularly. But it comes with its own risks. You know, I spoke to one Big Four partner who said, well, what happens is in the period before just in the couple of years leading up to your audit term coming to an end, you really concentrate on teeing up the client to sell consultancy services because you're going to be able to cash in there once you haven't got the audit contract. So it introduces its own kind of perverse incentives. And doesn't get anywhere near, I think, the fundamental problem, which is the profit motive within an audit contract, which is just inconsistent with an objective audit.
Okay, we're going to take a break now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Books will be available outside at a very modest price.